Hey there, potential podcaster. Do you want to finally get your show off the ground? Well, now you can get up to 2 months of free podcast hosting from Libsyn with my promo code CANLIT. That's CANLIT, and get up to 2 months of free podcast hosting from one of the best servers, and the one that we use here on the show. So what are you waiting for? Get your podcast off the ground. That's CANLIT for 2 months free. Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, an educative show in which sometimes we act like idiots. Today, we're going to be talking about education. What do you think of that accent?
It's okay, not the worst I've heard.
All right. Anyway,
It's
hello.
not the worst I've heard.
I don't know why I chose that specific accent. It was a spur of the moment thing. So today, we're going to, like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about education, but around like the Confederation-era, the later 19th century, I should say. And the reason for that is because it's interesting and it sets the groundwork for how a lot of education would kind of be moving forward in Canada, right? Even if obviously it has changed since then, thankfully, because as we'll see here, like there's some sketchy shit that goes on. But
Education? No.
And another reason why we're talking about this is that this is pretty much in Mac's wheelhouse, right? And so I'm interested in seeing him kind of go off, as he was saying, on some of the things we're going to be talking about today. And specifically, I thought it would be interesting to kind of talk about some of the issues that were facing education at this time, right? Rather than just going into what education was like, because that's pretty straightforward, like public schools, classical education doesn't really, take that long you don't need a full episode for that, let's say.
Right. Well, no, it's also we're focusing on the right topic for the time frame we're at as far as language and education goes.
Exactly.
As usual, most famously know about the issues of Quebec and language education, but it's a recurring issue throughout Canada because of the fact that we are a bilingual nation. But
absolutely,
most of the actual nation isn't really bilingual.
But I feel like that's in part because of what we're going to be talking about today. Because for a long time, there was a significant Francophone population outside of Quebec. And as we're going to be seeing, that was kind of like actively stifled, right? And so we can kind of talk about why that was and what the whole, logic behind it or how that occurred and what the impact was, I think, going forward.
Right.
Before, obviously, we get started, we like to thank our patrons, the wonderful people who support this show. Then, obviously, Craig, Jessica, Elise, Tommy, James, and Belinda, thank you very much for your lovely support. If you want to get the show ad-free and especially an extra show per month, which we will be releasing next week, hopefully, because we had a bit of a snafu last week.
Sorry.
That's fine. So we release an extra episode a month, and you can get that for as little as $3 a month. So thank you everyone for that support. All right. So getting into it a bit, I think we should start off with like a pretty broad question, but I think it is important here. As someone who has studied in the field of education, Mac, like what do you see the role of education being? And I think this will set the groundwork for like most of our conversation
That's
here.
A very complicated question. And honestly, it changes based on what period of time you are in.
Yes.
Because the idea is basically like the role of education changes and shifts and usually rises based on what the needs of society kind of are. So in the beginning, most people were not educated because they didn't need to be. Your father or your parents, whatever, they taught you how to farm, you continued on farming.
It wasn't formal education, I should say.
No.
You were educated, but not in like the way we imagine it today.
And then more formal education took place in things like artisanal schools, merchant guilds, things like that. Again, slightly more formal, but not like classroom learning. It was the idea of like if you were born into a carpenter, the carpenter taught you how to woodwork. If you're born into a family of merchants, general idea is that you will become a merchant yourself one day, take over whatever the family business may be. So on and so forth, moving up to the nobility, who had private tutors, and then who were then taught to be nobles.
Right. Or they were also just taught whatever the hell they wanted because they did have that freedom.
Yeah, exactly. If you were the second son, for example, you might go to a monastery and become and learn religious affairs, so on and so forth. But again, that education was dictated by the needs of the family. If you were a nobleman and you had 4 sons, you had to find something for each of them. Might as well make them all do something different, so that way you can then increase your spheres of influence. First one becomes the nobleman, second becomes his advisor, third becomes the religious connection,
so on and so forth.
Merchant, etc. Exactly, so on and so forth. But then the big thing happened, the Industrial Revolution. And suddenly people needed to know more because they were required to live more urban, and they had all these factories they needed to work in. And most importantly, kids needed something to do.
But also, like, I think it was, I was having a conversation with this not too long, with Camille and her family not too long ago, where it was like, you needed to learn how to sign contracts. So you perhaps need to learn to read, or like the rise of newspapers was becoming much more democratized.
Well, it's also the fact that like you needed to know signs in factories to understand danger. Like it was just like the living conditions became both better and worse.
Right.
And so people needed to be educated on how to navigate that.
Yes.
Which also dictated things like summer holidays, because the kids also still needed to be able to go help out at peak harvest season on the farm.
Yeah.
Why we still have huge summer holidays? No fucking clue. Different discussion, different topic for a different day.
I mean, what, are you going to have school like year round? No.
No, but lots of places don't have 2 months. They have maybe a month. Like if you go out to a lot of very successful school areas that are first world nations that have gone past the need for an agricultural society. The issue being large swaths of Canada and North America are also still partially agricultural, so it's a bit touch and go depending on where you are. Again, different topic. Quite totally different discussion. But now we see, but this sort of gets us to where we are at the moment in a post-Confederation Canada. This is the requirement of education. You go in, you learn a bit so that you can then go back and help the farm, so that you learn to negotiate, write contracts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It's a utilitarian exercise.
Again, like, and it's why it's why they established such large class sizes, because you weren't teaching super deep complex thoughts. You were just putting kids in seats so that you could be like, okay, write this letter 1,000 times, write this one, and then string them together. Okay, look, you made the word cat.
Right.
Good job.
Like you can read, write, maybe do a bit of math.
Basic arithmetic. So that, and again, that's also like the arithmetic you're going to learn on the job as a farmer. You know that, and then science out the window, not really
Probably
there.
Not, no.
Insofar that you'll learn agricultural science from your parents.
And again, this is at a basic level in like the public schools that were established in like the 1830s and 40s. Like once you got higher. Exactly.
And again, like for people looking for higher learning, it existed. For rich families, separate private schools already existed. One of Canada's oldest academic high schools, the Bishop's College School, where yours truly attended, was established in 1836.
Right.
As a small, it was a religious school. And again, privately funded, and that's where the rich kids went.
Right. And so you see the same thing for like McGill or something like that today.
I'm talking at like a basic general population level. This is the role of education. It is to meet the needs of the students that are currently there and what they need to do. And then going into the 20th century, that role changed because we suddenly had 2 wars, the rise of the computer, and we were in competition with Russia, with the Soviet Union. And so then the role of education became, you must become a functioning member of society who can also be part of the capitalist system to keep it going, so that way we outlast the USSR.
Right.
That was the goal.
It became very much an education that was based. It was based on much more like the STEM subjects and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. You saw a lot of growth in science, math, because we needed people who could work computers. We need people who could do complex calculations. We needed people who understood the way that the world works because we needed better rockets, we needed better weapons, we needed better computers, we needed better information technology, both in attacking and defending, and all that fun stuff.
I'm curious.
And then in the age we are currently in, it's shifted to fully digital. Like most education is on I'm not going to say it's complicated.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I was going to push back.
Really, it's all over the place.
You don't need to talk about it right now if you don't want to.
The role of education currently, that insofar in Canada, specifically Quebec, because that's what I'm most familiar with, is the creation of critical thinkers.
Okay.
Critical thinkers on a competency-based scale, where we want to create students who can go out, observe things, think from different perspectives, etc.
Right. I'm curious.
But that's what education wants. That's different from what government wants.
Okay, but that's what I was going to say. Like, do you think there's a link between the two, right? Between how, like, because you say, oh, it's based on the needs of society, but how much do you think is it based on the needs of whatever ruling class also? Because, like it or not, like, education is dictated in great part by
the ruling class.
Like, what kind of relationship?
And again, I'm telling you, like, what's been established in public schools in Quebec, the Quebec Education Program, QEP, basically states, like, again, we want critical thinkers, so on and so forth. And that's the theoretical, and then what is currently put into practice does not currently match up.
Right, exactly.
Just because of, again, a number of factors that like goes beyond any kind of comprehension we could do, not just from the ruling class, but also by the growing viewpoint that we should incorporate First Nations way of teaching and knowing, the debate, again, French versus English, private versus public, all these sorts of things.
It can go on. We can do a whole episode on that.
Yeah, on this, the current state of Canadian education. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So, as like, to kind of dial it back a bit to the time scale that we're talking about today.
They're being raised to be farmers and factory workers.
But that's the thing, is like, when we're thinking about education, right, and the role of the state or whatever ruling class, right, is like, you don't want them to be, at least in public education, you're not offering them the same level of standards for the masses as you are for, most of the richer or like upper middle class types, right? Because you want them to, yes, be educated and be satisfied, but still not be so educated that they'll move out from being farmers or factory workers necessarily, right? Or you give them the ability to just barely keep doing that. So there is a choice being there. And like you say, in some cases, it is a good choice because it's good that, people can read and write, obviously.
This is going to come from a very biased view, but I think education should be a number one priority.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, if we put any money anywhere, we should be putting it towards, well, first the environment. And then right below that is education, because education is very directly linked
half an inch below.
Yeah, and that's only because the environment is just a little bit more pressing. We're on a little bit more tight of a deadline. But I would also make the argument that education and the environment are very much directly linked to each other. That a more educated population takes better care of its environment.
Yeah.
But again...
I think that's, again, it's not to say that that's a bad thing that was the kind of education that was offered in the 19th century of a very classical one. But it is a choice.
I like that style at the beginning because it meant there was no elitism in the education. They were trying to get butts and seats.
Right.
And as soon as you start that, you can start doing the other stuff. But like, as an opening salvo, the idea of just trying to educate as much of the population as possible at a base level is, in my opinion, the perfect way to start.
Right. Okay.
Like, focus on getting everybody in the school, then you focus on keeping them there, and then you focus on getting them out of the school and into the better parts of the schools, into better schools, and so on and so forth.
Right. Okay.
But like, the fanciest education program in the world doesn't do you anything if you don't have people there to see it.
No, exactly. Right. Or people who have the ability to use it. Exactly. All right. So, kind of shifting gears a little bit, right? I do want to touch a little bit upon a brief section of the British North America Act, right? To kind of bring it back to the time period that we're talking. And specifically, I want to talk about Section 93, which is a small section, but it specifically relates to education, right? And what that is under, Canada going forward. And obviously, again, it'll change mostly, as you say, after the First World War, but this will kind of set the groundwork. So by and large, there are 4 points in this section.
As well as the very first point.
Okay.
In and for each province, the legislature may exclusively make laws in relation to education, subject and according to following provisions.
Right. So right off the bat. Right off the bat, it sets something that is still the case today, right?
Yeah, there's no federal mandate.
Right. Exactly. So that's why here in Quebec, for example.
Good or worse, there's no.
Right. But that's why here in Quebec, if you take a history class, it's very much centered around Quebec, right? Yeah. Whereas in other parts of Canada, say it's not as much, right? There are certain parts that change, right? But then after that, there's a bunch of really interesting provisions, including, I think the first one is the most important one, I think, for our discussion today, right? Nothing in any such law shall prejudicially affect any right or privilege with respect to denominational schools which any class of persons have by law in the province at the Union, right? Now, the use of denominational in this case is interesting because generally speaking, at least in Canada, the 2 main ones were Protestant and Catholic. Right. But that, historically speaking, there were a bunch of different denominations that also had their own schools, right? Mennonites were a big one, all kinds of populations.
Well, again, even if you look here, it's Roman Catholic versus, Eastern Orthodox, et cetera, et cetera.
Number 2, all the powers, privileges, and duties at the Union by law conferred and imposed in Upper Canada on the separate schools and school trustees of the Queen's Roman Catholic subjects shall be, and the same hereby extended to the dissentient schools of the Queen's Protestant and Roman Catholic subjects in Quebec. Right. So it's a bit of a legalese way of saying that they have the same rights, right? As a Roman Catholic or a Protestant school or whatever denomination.
Now, when they're saying Roman Catholic and Protestant, that's only half of what they're saying, because part of what they're really saying is
drum roll,
Anglophone.
There you go.
This is what they're releasing. I'm not going to say Quebec and non-Quebec, but because there was a large English-speaking population in Quebec,
and there's a large French-speaking population outside.
Francophone versus Anglophone. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Francophones they're Roman Catholics, and then Anglophones Protestant. Yeah.
Yeah, but then it gets a bit dicey because you had huge Irish populations which were English-speaking but also Catholic. So where do these people go?
The Irish.
Always screwing everything up.
Which is why you have a large Irish population in cities like Montreal.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. But
it's almost like shit's connected.
Yeah.
Wild.
Who'd have thunk?
Who'd have thunk that immigration being forced into French-speaking schools started as early as this?
Yeah. But it's also, and this is perhaps a statement on our current state of affairs here, but whatever, I don't care. They integrated. They actually learned French. Oh my God. Right? It's not like there's a huge English-speaking Irish population now. Right?
It's not like
it doesn't matter. It's stupid. Right. If anyone's wondering what we're talking about, check out the whole debate about Bill 96 and whatever, but it's...
Well, it's just continuing to, again, we'll be touching upon this a lot for the other provinces, because this is a hot button topic issue.
Yeah.
No matter where you go, about what language you teach and where you go to teach it. And I think part of what they were, again, this B&A Act, that line at the beginning, making this a provincial matter versus federal.
Yeah.
Do we know who made this particular one? Was it the old man himself?
Was it Mr. McDonald? Yeah. I don't know. It's hard to say because I think
I have to think it's somebody within his sphere of influence. Just because you make that in mind, the rest of the provinces are gonna almost boot French out the window.
But see, that's the thing. It might not have been, because MacDonald was a very federally centered person. He was very interested in having federal power, like concentrated, right, into
Right.
federal.
Well, so whoever was doing
So
this,
probably it was like some kind of liberal MP or liberal government that was pushing back against it at the time. They would have been much more provincially oriented. Yeah.
Whoever was doing it, by provincial powers for sure, but they also, I almost want to say they were not anti-francophone, but they had ulterior motives in mind.
But see, that's kind of what's interesting, and what we'll see with the different provinces that we're going to touch on as we see how they operate, is that both conservative and liberal governments enacted legislation that would limit this very law, right? And so it's kind of interesting that you're saying that, of like, so it kind of seems to be much bigger than just party politics in this case, right? I feel like it's going much more into a general imperial mindset, right? That is inherited from the British. Anyway, that's that's something that we can discuss at the end if you want. But basically, as you say, it kind of opens the door for languages and religions of all kinds, right? Having their denominational schools, as long as they're accepted by the provincial government, right? And specifically, the BNA Act protects denominational schools that had been established prior to Confederation. So it's not like a clean slate. They're like schools that had been there can continue to operate.
Like BCS.
Like what? Sorry?
Like Bishop's College School.
Oh, okay.
Founded in 1836.
Yeah, pretty much.
First place in Canada to raise the Canadian flag.
There you go. Right. But
beat out Parliament Hill by 30 minutes.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
fantastic.
literally
because of like a miscommunication or something, Bishop's College School was the first place in Canada to raise the current Canadian flag, like the design. We have one of the oldest Canadian flags still.
Oh, it's still up.
No, it's not like it's behind
okay.
It's behind the space.
Oh, okay. I was like, damn, that's
but it's one of the oldest Canadian flags in existence.
So that's awesome.
I went to a fucking Harry Potter Hogwarts place, I swear to God.
What was your favorite potion to make?
Anyway.
It was a dumb joke. Anyway, so basically going forward here for the rest of the episode, I wanted to go through different provinces and see how they specifically related to this act, right? And in many ways it limited it, but it was often also in reaction to certain policies and
before
ideas.
We go any further, we are not going to be talking about a certain elephant in the room, just because that is a very different topic.
I was thinking about that before recording, because what Mac is referring to is a history of like racial segregation in
I was
Canada.
talking about the residential schools.
Also, that too. So like
that's the I mean, insofar that like those big we're gonna talk about segregation a little bit for sure. But I feel like as far as the history of that atrocity goes, that is something again that's a whole topic,
episode,
an issue that we want to discuss in a place where we can spend more time on it.
Absolutely.
It doesn't become a footnote.
Right.
So clarify now.
100%. Residential school is their own episode. But as you're talking about as well, there is some, we have to address the fact that segregation did exist as well in Canada. We tend to imagine it as a bright and rosy place in which slavery did not exist. Yeah. And right where the Underground Railroad came and blah, blah, blah.
It was the land of milk and honey.
Sure. But, for most of the 19th century, well, actually for the entirety of the 19th century, really, there were segregated schools in Canada as well, right? For both Black populations in Canada and Asian populations that you saw mostly in the western parts of Canada and BC, that was also the case, right? And the way that they kind of brought this about, and this relates education back again to politics, as we were bringing up earlier, sometimes it was through explicit laws, right? As Ontario's Common School Act, for example, specifically featured a clause that would separate and segregate schools, right? Specifically. Yeah. But also sometimes it was just they changed electoral districts in order to stop Black kids from attending white schools because they're not in the proper district to attend that school, right? So it's a whole history of back alley dealings and stuff like that would stop minorities, racial minorities from attending white schools, right?
No, and Yeah, and this is something we still kind of see today.
Okay.
Especially in the school district's case, like that's a big issue that people don't really look at or talk about enough. But
yeah, no, absolutely. And like, it's not a surprise that the poorer neighborhoods are often like mostly the most underfunded ones for school, and they're often minority populations
because they have lower test scores.
It's all related.
They don't get funding, so then they keep those lower test scores, and it all keeps the same.
Or again, because they're poorer, they don't have necessarily as good food, which affects like the way that they
energy.
Or
no, it's even at a neighborhood level.
Oh,
if you're in a poor neighborhood, you don't have access to grocery markets.
Yeah.
You live on depender food, which means that you don't eat healthy food, and then you don't have the energy that you need, and then you can't get to school on time, or you can't think straight and do homework.
Yep.
Like, it's a whole web of effects that keeps piling on top of each other.
Absolutely. And again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on segregation for two reasons. One, again, I think we're
not smart enough to talk about that.
But like, we have whole episodes that are going to be planned on how Asian Canadians of like whether Japanese, Chinese, all kinds of Asian Canadians would be treated. And also the same thing for African Canadians around this time. Like, this is all planned.
Yeah.
But also
Black Canadians like immigrants, Canadians that like, there's all sorts of different topics and facets of education in relation to that.
Yeah. I feel also, I'm choosing my words carefully here, and perhaps this is just me because I'm well versed in it, but I feel like this is the most evident act of imperial, like, I'm choosing my words carefully in this case. It's like segregation was a fact, right? And it's like, I don't know what else to say about it at this point other than like, yeah, there was racism in Canada explicitly, and it's terrible. But it's like, that was the fact of it, right? And
no, I get you. There's obviously things we can't talk about, the literature that came out at the time and how it specifically took place. Again, talking more about these laws, but you're right. It is part of it is at the end of the day, segregation was a thing.
Yeah, that was a thing. And I feel like compared to the rest of the topics that we're going to be talking about today.
It's also compared to the rest of the topics, we all can now basically agree it was a bad thing.
Yes.
A decision has been,
I think, like, a common decision.
We again, obviously there's issues that still persist today. Again, looking at school districts, like funding.
Sure, but I think socially we've all kind of agreed that this was terrible.
Yeah, socially, segregation, like explicit laws of segregation, should not exist.
Absolutely.
Language laws
are still a thing.
Oh, goddamn.
They're still a thing, and it's like, the segregation thing, I feel, is a known part of acts of imperialism, right? That were that were inherited from that were inherited from the British.
My pigmentation is different, therefore I am a superior human being.
Right.
Logic.
None. But what's interesting is that I feel like
Trivago.
Like, I think it is interesting nonetheless to both talk about that, but also talk about how it applies to language and the kind of backward logic, or at least the hoops that people would go through to justify these language laws, that I feel people are not aware of the deep history of this type of language. We hear about it in modern contexts, right? But I feel like people are not as generally aware of these types of regulations that affected the French language, for example, as they are of the history of segregation. Perhaps I'm wrong in this case, but I feel like that makes it also an interesting topic to address at the very least.
Right.
Anyway, perhaps I just put my foot in my mouth. Regardless.
Who knows? At least we're trying.
At least we're trying. Yay, A for effort.
No, but it's like,
no, you're right.
The best way to beat back against the Canadian blanket of we're gonna shove this shit under the table is to just start talking about it.
Yeah.
Even if you sound like a total jackass, like, you open yourself up to be criticized, and people can then educate you so you can get smarter.
Absolutely. So please do. If we said something stupid today, tell us.
Educate us, please.
Send an email.
In education, I like to learn.
So
I'm used to being lectured. Just ask my mother.
She has a doctorate in lecturing.
Doctorate in nagging, but that's besides the point.
So I feel like it would be important to at least establish what it looked like in Quebec, right? Because that's typically what we understand as like the, I guess, homeland, if you will, of French speaking in Canada, right? At least today. And their first reaction, right, is that under Premier Chauveau, who was a long-standing premier in Quebec in the 19th century, Protestants and Catholics were divided into their own school committees, which, by the way, you kind of see a similar thing today. There's English and French in Quebec, and you can perhaps tell me more about this, but there's English and French school boards, and they operate differently, right? Here in Quebec, at the very least. And I feel like that's pretty much where this started, would have been in this 19th century decision to distinctly create separate committees for Catholics and Protestants. Right? But and this is kind of opens us up to this whole debate that we're going to be having today, or at this time. Protestant minorities in Quebec wanted in writing at least explicit guarantees for their autonomous organization and control of their own schools, right? And there's all kinds of debates that are happening in this moment. There's that bill was met with hostility, including some of the French language press, right, which in some nationalist capacity, which we will talk about in other episodes, like didn't want necessarily Protestants to have their own separate schools, right? Because it would deter the learning of French. Hint, hint, same debates as kind of what you see today, but whatever, right? But it was generally seen, like this bill at least was generally seen as a stepping stone for how they hoped the rights of Catholics and other, i.e. French people, in other provinces would be treated, right? Say like, look, we're giving Protestants their own school committees, we're giving Catholics their own school committees, and we're letting them do what they want. How about you take an example from this, right? We're letting them be. But again,
there's leaving people alone.
Just who knew? Again, and this would kind of get sketchy over time, as we saw with the rise. We've alluded to it many times on the show with the rise of French Canadian nationalism, both in the late 19th century, right, and later, right, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. This type of law would kind of get muddied. But by and large, it's an interesting stepping stone, I feel, right? And at least on paper, a good intervention by the government in this case of saying like, hey, you have your own rights, if you will, right? Maybe you could disagree with me on that, but like that's, I think, a good and interesting way of separating, well, in this case, church and state. Right?
Separate church and state, please.
No, but that's like, I guess that's an underlying element of a lot of it as well, right? Is the separation of church and state, right? We've been talking about it in terms of language, but that's a church and state thing.
Yeah, and again, that was part of like what religion you were was also what language you were, by and large at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else that you wanted to add about Quebec specifically? I feel like it's pretty straightforward, at least where this is concerned. Like it'll be more dicey as we get to the other provinces.
Yeah, well, because Quebec's straightforward insofar that it's where the most discussion still remains.
Yeah.
Whereas the other provinces, they more or less have answers that they see happen.
Now they are.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like now the debate in Quebec continues and rages to this day, like a bad pimple.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, as we'll see, and this kind of segues us quite nicely into New Brunswick, right? In other provinces, it caused literal riots, right? Yeah. And straight up death.
Yay!
So we've talked about Acadians before, right? The French-speaking population of the Maritimes. A lot in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, some in PEI. But they believed that the French speakers at least believed, and the Catholics, that under Article 93 of the British North America Act, that their right to provincially funded schools, right, was guaranteed, right, because they had been established before Confederation. But, and here's kind of where it gets dicey again, is in the use of language. In 1871, right, New Brunswick established the Common Schools Act, which created a whole system of publicly funded and specifically non-confessional schools, right? And so their new system was not related to denomination or faith, right? And so then that opens the door to a whole question of, okay, well, now who's entitled to public funding?
Right.
And it basically prohibited or restricted, I should say, forms of religious teaching or symbols in provincially funded schools. And so the Catholic minority in New Brunswick, the Acadians, kind of pushed back against this, right? And for like 3 years after the passing of the Common Schools Act, it was actually a hotly debated topic, right? And there were requests by Catholics in New Brunswick that the federal government kind of backtrack this legislation. But then because it's a provincially guarded right, it couldn't right, necessarily do that. So it went all the way to the Privy Council, which at the time was quite a high committee, right?
Right.
And it basically said, bite me. The provinces have the right to define publicly funded education, right? There's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, no, but that's like, again, that's what they chose. That was what was written up in the law.
Yep. And it's like, but it's always that debate in which you see again and again is like, well, yes, there's a certain, you can establish what education is, but then it gets into what is the role of the state in the protection of minority rights?
Yeah.
Right. And is it a purely education-based thing in this case? And I think what a lot of Catholics in New Brunswick are arguing is that, no, it's not just an education thing. And that's where the federal government can kind of maybe step in. Right.
Yeah. Again, my own opinion on it is separation of church and state.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that said, I'm fine with religious, like if people have their religious symbols in the classroom.
I don't care. No.
I don't think that's going to be pushing religion onto anybody. It's the students are fine. If the students have a practicing religion, they should be within boundaries and with respect to their fellow classmates, they should be able to bring that into the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
The school itself as a framework should not.
No, but that being said, like, I don't think teachers should be disallowed of having religious symbols necessarily.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
As a person, you should be allowed to express your religion.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I also don't see, like, I've never actually heard of teachers showing up with their religious symbols and trying to convert students.
No, I've never heard of that.
I've never actually heard that be a thing.
No.
Like, maybe there's a couple minor cases, but I've never heard it be like it was an epidemic or anything, you know?
No, exactly. But it
was.
I
also don't think that, to that train of thought, I don't think fathers, nuns, like religious leaders should be allowed to be teachers.
Interesting, because they're so close to
because they are like, I don't think they do it on purpose.
Yeah.
But subconsciously, I really like, if they'd be allowed to teach, they would have to be, again, in a support capacity maybe, or they teach specifically religious studies course.
Right. That makes sense. But to bring it back to the example of New Brunswick in this case, right? It seems like they had an interesting idea of moving away again from the idea of church and state. But they also used it as a backhanded way of just, kind of smothering the Catholic minority out of existence, right? So there is a political implication in this, right? Whether you agree with church and state separation or not, like that's kind of what happened, right? And in the 19th century, religion was still a major factor, right? And the religious authorities were by far the more educated ones.
Oh, for sure. And again, that's like, you're going to see the power lies with the educated population.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's why they don't want to fix education, because then they'll lose their power.
Absolutely. It's not a conspiracy theory, folks. That's just how power works.
The Republican Party works on a platform. Like, their strategy is literally they care about the House and all that. But years ago, they focused on school board and who won school board election.
Absolutely.
That's where they started with their strategy, and now it's paying off insofar that they own the school boards and they can teach whatever they want, which then has allowed them to do things like gerrymandering, winning the House, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. But you see that, to bring it back to a Canadian example of this time, and I forgot to mention this when we were talking about Quebec, you see this specifically in this time with the rise of what was called ultramontanism, which was basically a form of radical Catholicism, which thought that the Pope was the one above all, and Quebec should just follow the rule of the Pope, basically. But these ultramontanes, one of the ways that they garnered power was by putting their hands in education, right? And being able to mold future generations.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the reasons why English education at this time was not as prioritized. And it's, you used education as very much a political tool, right? And so, in this case, the Ultramontanes were very close to power in many ways, but they used education as well to that effect. So to bring it back to New Brunswick, right? Obviously, the debate didn't end there, as I kind of alluded to, and there was more and more public outcry against the laws, and it was followed by acts of public disobedience, right? And so here's like the most metal thing, I think. Like this is a true act of rebellion where Acadians just refused to pay school taxes, and they used self-imposed parallel taxes, right, to maintain private Catholic schools, and they hired clerics to teach their children in publicly funded schools, even though it was just like clearly illegal. But I think that's really cool. It's just like, F you, we're going to create our own tax.
We do it.
What? Imagine trying to do that today, though, of just being like, no, I refuse to pay my taxes. I'm going to create my own tax system that just goes toward what I want. Metal.
Okay, one way to do it.
I mean, again, it was probably easier
at the show. Like, what are they gonna do otherwise?
But that's the thing. It's like,
if you don't participate in the system enough, like, what's it gonna do?
Right. Well, it was. I saw that as well. It was who's the guy who wrote The Man in the High Castle? Philip K. Dick, right? The famous science fiction author. That's one of the things that he did as well to like protest the Vietnam War, was just refuse to pay his taxes if it went to funding the American military. And like they sent him to jail, and it was a valuable protest in many ways. But it's like, yeah, hit him where it hurts, hit him in the money. Like that's how these institutions keep going, is through public money. So if you don't give them that, of course they're gonna notice. Right. I think the Acadians were onto something in this case.
Don't pay your taxes, folks.
Just there you go.
That hurts society more than anything else.
I mean, really.
That's the Rick and Morty episode where the kids are like, how are you going to destroy the government? Are you going to like send the fleets against each other? Blah, blah. It's like, no, I'm just going to fuck with the economy a bit. I'm going to change a 1 to a 0.
Then everything goes to shit. Yeah, absolutely. But you see that in time and time again, like public insecurity is often related to finances, right? In times of economic crisis, that's where people are most agitated, right? It's not a surprise, right? Because that's when the government is at its weakest often. So in 1875, let's say when the situation in New Brunswick peaked, right? When there was a resistance that was formed in the town of Caraquet or Caraquet, I don't know. And there was an armed confrontation between a local militia group that had formed and Acadians, right? And it resulted in 2 deaths, but a number of injuries. So Louis Mailloux, who was an Acadian protester, and a militiaman named John Gifford, who
Jeez, it's almost
died.
Like if people have the right to bear arms and form militias, it doesn't lead to anywhere good.
I don't know how like legal this militia was or not.
It would be in another country. If they were a bit more south, it'd be perfectly legal.
But at the time, also, I don't know what kind of rules were imposed in Canada for gun ownership.
Oh, I know. I'm just trying to make a point about somewhere else.
Yeah, that's fair. We all know things are going weird.
In our pants. In the pants of Canada, things are going weird.
So basically, after again showing just how much like where things are, how people pay attention to certain things, it's at this moment that the provincial government was like, okay, how about we just make a compromise, right? And publicly funded schools were allowed to teach catechism, right, the Catholic dogma, after school hours, right? As well as they were allowed to, and here's where it comes back to what you were saying, they were now allowed to display and wear religious symbols.
Right.
Right. So at least like there's some foothold in.
And again, I'm fine with that compromise as long as it's optional. Like as long as no kid is forced to learn and do any kind of religion.
Right. It was allowed. Fine. They didn't have to go to this. Yeah, absolutely. But despite this like whole this whole affair, right? it was like the Common Schools Act is considered to be a pretty significant piece of legislation in 19th century New Brunswick. And indeed, by some people, it's considered one of the most significant, in part because of how it notably increased the number of students in schools, right? Again, coming back to your point of like, it just put butts in seats, right? By 18, I think it was like 7 years later, the number of students in public school had doubled in New Brunswick. Like, it was massively successful. And I think in part it's because it removed this tension of whether you go to a Catholic or Protestant school, right? You just go to school, right? Which I think is kind of cool. And in some ways, it did strengthen French language teaching, right? It did continue to happen, and it would allow, Francophone populations in New Brunswick, and especially Acadians, to kind of maintain their culture for a while, right?
Yay!
That being said, we're keeping to the late 19th century here, but as we'll see over time, it kind of changes because the Acadian population is not huge nowadays.
Yeah. I think they found a compromise that works for them, and it's fine.
Yep.
Again, you're trying to meet the needs of the area you live in, and so if a large enough people are okay with some form of religious teaching, I say as long as it's not forced or mandatory, go ahead.
Right. I agree.
As long as the general population is okay with their tax dollars being funded into this, who gives a shit?
Right. But that's the thing. They weren't. And so they changed it with tax dollars.
With their tax dollars. You have power.
Yeah.
Rise up. Throw off your chains.
Don't pay your taxes.
Don't like what your taxes are going towards. Don't pay it.
Yeah. There you go. That's our radical statement of the week. So now we're going to head into a different province, which did continue to pay its taxes, Ontario.
Ayo.
So as we mentioned before, in the same year that New Brunswick would pass its own school act, Ontario did the same, right? Which legislated that free compulsory elementary school in government inspected schools was to be provided for everyone. So again, not high school. There was no such thing as having to stay in school until 16 at the time. It was just elementary school, right? And this act would also transform grammar schools, which is what it was for most of the public schools at the time, into two types of schools. Specifically, this is when we get to high school. So again, most people couldn't afford that necessarily, but that's later education, if you will. And one of them was focused on classical education, right? English grammar, composition, Greek, Latin, math, natural history, that kind of stuff. And these were called collegiate institutes. And then you also had high schools, right? And that also offered classical training, but it also had a track for an English course that focused on natural sciences and practical topics instead of the classics, which is a weird name. If you're going to call it an English course, why focus on the natural sciences? I don't know. But I guess it's that image of keeping in mind of like, oh, the British mentality or something like that, or like academic elitism. I don't know what the logic was behind it. I should have looked into it and I didn't.
The logic was separation of class.
Yep, probably.
And we still have that.
Yep.
And we have vocational schools and we have universities. And that's fine. Having vocational schools and universities with higher academic learning is fine. Like having places that focus on different topics.
Yes.
It's the valuation of those is where the problem comes in.
Yep. Because like how much emphasis
like it or not, we need plumbers. Yeah. I can't do my own plumbing.
You plebe.
I'm going to have a master's degree soon. I can't fix my pipes. Patrick is going to have a PhD. He can't fix his pipes.
I can fix some pipes. I can fix my shower head.
Google can only take it so far. Genuinely speaking, we need, and they should be valued higher. These vocational trade schools
absolutely
should be valued higher than they currently are, because we're seeing the results of that in our current day where we have nobody who can do these trades.
Yeah. And it's also the question of valuing public education or private education or things like that. Like how much, like, let's face it, there's still this mentality of people going to public school and being like, going to private school and being like, Yeah, I have my high school degree from, I have a high school diploma from
Bishop's College School.
Yeah, it's like, but that's kind of the thing is, it was interesting. It's like, I also went to private high school and I ended up in the exact same fucking place as many of my peers from elementary school who went to public school their entire time. Right. It's like, there is a certain level of that we need to consider.
You're not actually paying for a difference in education. Like, as somebody who went to private, like very like the private school of Canada.
Yeah.
You're not actually like the difference in educational level is. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist because that would be a disservice to many great teachers that I have.
Yeah, there are some really good teachers. Yeah, that's for sure.
But the greater thing that was there was opportunity and connection.
Yes.
I have people that I went to school with that now play for NHL teams, or their families run large businesses, or they are now high-level engineers or economists or whatever.
And here in Quebec, it looks better to get into CEGEP or something like that.
Or you draw on these connections where the university you want to go to has alumni that went to my school.
Right.
My school, one of the big people that went to my school's last name was Molson.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah.
We have the Molson student building named after them, and that's what you're really paying for.
Yes, you're paying for the name, you're paying for the prestige of it. But having compared to the students that I in conversation, and you'd probably be better at it to say it than me, but the education that they received in public school is not that different than what I received in private school.
Again, it all depends on the school you go to.
Of course.
Funding. It also depends on what subject you're talking about. Yeah, yes, maybe in the general subjects, not so much of a difference. But
the ability to tell those.
Well, no, but in the sciences, in the arts, there can be wildly different levels of education just because these private schools have the funding, which is, again, part of driven by that necessity. Public high schools have a belief that they're not funding people to create the arts. They're still working on the mentality of, we are creating people who are going to run dépanneurs, run factories, go home and farm.
Yeah.
Private school boys like me and you, meanwhile, have the money, or we're going to have the capital based on our family that we can draw on to go into arts programs, humanities, create podcasts about asinine things like Canadian literature, all that fun stuff.
It's not asinine, but okay.
When the fact of the matter is, all young people have similar levels of inherent potential.
Yeah, I agree.
Privilege just places you on a different part of the path.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I'm not trying to discredit the work that me, you, and everybody else put in, like that went to a private school, put into their time there. No,
but it's you start off with a different level. Yeah,
you start off at a different level. You start off on a different path.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, you can only go so far without putting in your own hard work.
Yeah.
But it's gonna be a lot easier to go a lot farther.
I 100% agree.
The path is much more efficient.
Right. And I think to kind of like bleed into this idea of elitism that you're talking about, right? And bring it back to Ontario in this case, like this English elitism, if you will, the English course and all that, English was made into a mandatory subject in 1885, right? Both in elementary school and high school. And 5 years later, in 1890, it was extended to making it the sole language of instruction, except under specific conditions where this was not possible.
Right.
So, for example, like when you're talking, if you take a French class or whatever, right? Or still in French communities. But like it or not, it becomes an issue, right? You can have on paper that French people can have their own denomination, their own schools and all that. But if English is the mandatory subject and English is the language of education and instruction, at some point, there's only so much that you can do as a French institution, right? And we're getting a little bit outside of our purview of the show here, but the Ontario schools question, unlike in New Brunswick, became an issue a bit later in the early 1900s, right? And by then it was no longer focused on denomination, but it was they dropped the pretense and it was specifically language based, right? And
language based.
Yeah. And it actually pit English. In this case, it's notable because it pit English Catholics and Protestants against Franco-Ontarians, right? Or Franco-Catholic. So in this case, whether you were Catholic or Protestant didn't matter. It was language that dictated what you wanted to do or who you sided with, right?
I mean, despite the fact that Canada says bilingual nation, there's always one language or culture that wants to be on top of the other.
Yeah.
Like, no matter how much we say we want to be a bilingual nation, we don't actually want to be a bilingual nation.
But that's the thing is like, and this is kind of the lesson of the show, if you will, is that, hey, at some point, there was a deliberate choice to not make it a bilingual nation, right?
Yeah.
Like there were notable populations of French speakers in New Brunswick and Ontario. And as we're going to see just now in Manitoba. And like active rules made it so that was slowly eked out of the population because there were laws that said you could only teach in English.
They took a look at what Laura Durham said and they'd be like, hey, what if we did this, but not as overt?
What if we were actually subtle about it?
First.
Yeah.
The Quebecois, they don't want to be told what to do by religions either. We all came here to be free of religious prosecution.
Yep.
Wink, wink.
And so by 1910, the Franco-Ontarians did actually start to organize and promote their interests, but this was met with hostility. And I think by then their numbers had dwindled enough that it was much more difficult to organize. Mm-hmm. And by 1912, under a conservative government, there was the famous Regulation 17 that was passed, right, which limited French instruction to the first 2 years of elementary schooling, right? Mm-hmm. And this would lead to an actual political crisis. And it ultimately, right around the time that it came in, and we'll talk about this in later episodes, but it would relate to larger federal issues around like conscription crises and constitutional issues that were happening right around the First World War. And so this kind of is much larger than what we're pointing to here in the specific scope of education. But the Regulation 17 would officially stay in place, I think, like in its full capacity for, 10 or 20 years, if I remember correctly. But on the books, it stayed for a bit longer. And it's only much later that the Ontario government would actually formally apologize for having put into place Regulation 17. Right. Mm-hmm. That one's a bit straightforward. And the last one that I wanted to talk about today was...
That's the Ontario for you.
Yeah. The last one I wanted to mention today was Manitoba.
Manitoba.
And Manitoba, before actually researching this episode, was the one that I had known about because Manitoba specifically went into Confederation as a bilingual province, mm-hmm. right? Like that was intended as such, right? In the Manitoba Act, they mentioned that there are both French, Métis often speaking populations and English populations, right? But as we've known from doing 80 episodes of this show, not only are they French, but they're Indigenous.
Which means they get double fucked.
They get double fucked. It's not great.
It's a 2-for-1 sale.
Yep, absolutely. So Manitoba, like I said, entered Canada as a dual denominational system. And, much like other provinces, their schools were divided on linguistic and sectarian grounds. But as time went on, Manitoba's government encouraged, and the federal government encouraged immigration trends by people who would speak English, right? And especially these people who would enter into the Western provinces like Manitoba and eventually Alberta, Saskatchewan, etc. Right? And so this is the encouragement of populations like the Germans or Scandinavians, for whom English was a much easier language to learn than French, mm-hmm. right? Often because there are similar linguistic roots and because globally speaking, English was already the language of business in many ways. And so a lot of people would have learned English, or at least a basic of English, a basic level of English. So it's easier to bring these immigrants in and kind of flood the French out, if you will. And formally, right, bilingualism in the government suffered its first blow in 1875 with when the use of French in elections was abolished in ridings where Anglophones were specifically the majority. So it's kind of interesting to see like how this works. It's like, no, see, we're a majority anyway. Like but I think it's exactly what you were saying before of like, you're just doing it, but more subtly. Right. And that's how these kinds of massive changes occur, is like when you just change it little bit by little bit without people necessarily noticing that,
you put it as a byline in every 10th law or so.
Exactly. Right. And, who's going to notice? Anglophones are the majority in this case. So it doesn't matter. Right. And it's only later, under a Liberal premier, right, Thomas Greenway, that the Public School Act of 1890 explicitly removed tax support for denominational schools like Catholic schools and created non-sectarian public school system, which on the surface sounds very similar to what you saw in New Brunswick. But at the same time, by that very same token, French was also abolished as an official language of the province. Just like, fuck it, right? And parents could send their children to French Catholic schools, but they would not be funded. And as you were saying at the time, it's very difficult for a lot of people to send their children to school if they have to pay for it, because not a lot of people are super rich, right? Still is today, right? The case.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right.
The public versus private debate's been all great for a while.
Yeah, exactly. But like, remove public funding from a lot of elementary schools, you'll see that the number of people that can send their children to school is going to drop drastically, right? Even today. So imagine in 1890, right, when most of these people are farmers, right? But on top of it, to add like insult to injury, they would still have to pay taxes to the public school system that ultimately fucked them, right? And like, I get it, you should pay like your taxes to support this public school system, but it's like, again, you want to pay your taxes to something that you agree with. If ultimately it's screwing you over, well, you don't really want to, right?
Yeah. And again, I don't hold anger towards anybody about that,
Yeah.
It's their prerogative.
Absolutely. But it is interesting though, where tensions, as you saw in other provinces, did arise between French and English Canadians in Manitoba. And ultimately, this is, from what I've understood, like the match that ignited the larger federal debate was the one that happened in Manitoba, right? And basically what you saw is that in cities, right, where the Catholics were a minority, that's where you saw it have most, like these laws have most impact, right? But in the countryside, where it was still mostly French Canadian communities, because they weren't, they were well established there. Ultimately, these communities controlled local school boards and municipalities, and so very little changed in that regard, right? They were able to kind of get by and still maintain some level of autonomy, right, going forward. But what you kind of see is that as cities and people in cities get more and more wealthy, right, and as people in the countryside, are pushed more to the margins, if you will, and are increasingly poorer, obviously it creates bigger social divides because, well, those people who are poorer tend to be French Canadian, right? And so that creates more issues, and then you feel like you need to move and so on. And yeah, English kind of slowly dominates in Manitoba. Right? Lovely stuff. The look on your face is just like,
it's the system. How do I say this? It's not something that's going to be easily rectified. And I think a lot of it is a case of mistaken goals, where people think we all have the same goal. Right. We really don't. As we see, Manitoba doesn't want to be a dual language place.
Or at least those in power don't want it to be
those
dual
in power
language.
don't want it to be dual language. And to be honest, those in power in Quebec don't want it to be dual language either.
No. Nope. But it is interesting because, as you were mentioning,
they'd think otherwise, since being bilingual is a good thing, but by being bilingual, it adds a level of complexity more than anything else. People just want simple.
That's the thing. It's like that's why I was mentioning at the beginning of our recording when we were saying, this seems to have transcended political lines, right? Yeah. No matter, like, these acts were passed by conservative governments, by liberal governments, but ultimately they were passed by Anglophones, right? Yep. Or in Quebec, Francophones, right? So it's a question of power in this case, and how can you leverage it to the best of your advantage, right? And I think one of the reasons why this episode or this discussion, I think, is important is for people to is it helps people realize just how politicized education is.
Oh God, yes. Education is not a pure thing. Education is one of the most political things you can look at.
And I don't think you can avoid that, right? No matter what kind of system you're going to put in, there is always going to be a form of bias, right? But I think that this is emblematic of it, right? And the second thing I wanted to mention, and then I don't know if you had any final thoughts, because I kind of went through all I wanted to talk about personally in this case, and we've kind of zigzagged through various topics, so it's fine. But this will open us up to other episodes in many ways. The divisions that were created here would very much, like I said, lead to a federal debate, but it would also help with the rise of a certain bilingual politician named Wilfrid Laurier.
Right. And he's going to challenge our. So, have we gotten to a third prime minister yet?
Soon, yeah. We.
Who is the third prime minister?
So theoretically, MacDonald, because he came back, but
we're going to skip him again.
We'll skip him again. But it was funny because there was MacDonald, Mackenzie, MacDonald, and then there were a bunch of like prime ministers that stayed for like a year or 6 months after MacDonald died in office. And then there was Wilfrid Laurier.
Because we have to make our list.
Yeah. So we'll get to Wilfrid Laurier, but I wanted to do an episode.
Abbott, John Thompson, Mackenzie Bowell.
Yeah. Those are all the like those 6 month
Charles
ones.
Tupper.
Yep.
And then Wilfrid Laurier.
There you go. So we're going to do one episode, I think, on like all those 4 that were in betweeners because they suck. You lost your audio
for a second there.
Sorry. So yeah, we're gonna do like an episode on all 4 of those like middleman ones, and because they suck. They don't do much.
They don't do anything.
They really don't do much, but they're there just while waiting for the next election. And
they're there waiting for the next big guy to show up.
Yeah, but that's interesting is that Laurier would run specifically on a platform, or significantly, not specifically, but significantly on a platform of bilingualism and uniting French and English elements in Canada through a debate that was started in what we're talking about today.
While also removing the right of status Indians to vote.
Yes, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So did you have any final thoughts on anything that we talked about today? Like, I think we've kind of talked about like why French was particularly targeted because it was, it went against the hegemonic ideas of.
If you have a problem with your education and the education that your child gets, best thing that you can do is get involved.
Yes.
Be part of the PTA, be part of volunteer, be a lunch lady, be a librarian, whatever.
Posting on Facebook and Twitter is not what's going to do it.
No, you have to be actively involved within the system.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're just like, you show up to the sports games to help support the students.
Yep.
You are actively showing the school that you will be there and that your voice is important and that you will have some sort of influence and therefore you will be able to make decisions. As we've seen, schools are not really handled at a federal level.
No.
Even at the Canadian provincial level, the school boards themselves play a role, and beyond the school boards, the individual schools play a role because there's actually not a very large monitoring process.
No, and there's
not a huge check system in place.
And even theoretically, it wasn't. Again, I heard from it here, but like you could vote on who was commissioner and stuff like that, but the turnout level was just minimal. No one cares.
Oh, yeah.
It's like
nobody
get involved.
Cares about. But the thing is, those are the most important elections.
Right.
Those are the most important. All the municipal, the city level, school board level. Those are the most important elections that need the most turnout.
I agree. Yep.
And if you really want to change to that system, if you want to change what's being taught in your classroom, get involved and act like proactively involved. And so far, that's a positive influence, not just bitching and moaning on Facebook.
Yep. Absolutely.
Like find ways to contribute and contribution occurs.
I agree. All right.
And that goes for anywhere, but especially in Canada where we have this large, like as we saw with the Acadians, they got involved. They didn't pay their taxes.
Like, and you can agree or disagree with it, but they actually got involved. They did something that changed the system. Yep.
That's what that's what I see a real lack of when people complain about things like the education system, the imbalance of the education system, the lack of teachers, the lack of school supplies or whatever. Like you have to, at the moment, if your government is not fulfilling the needs that you want them to, you have to actively do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I know we didn't talk so much about educational policies, how they relate to the current, but that's because a lot of it, like education teaching, has not really updated with the times at all. We don't do new things. We're still doing the same shit we did 100 years ago.
Yep, absolutely.
Which is a problem of itself, but whatever.
Yeah.
What do I know?
Nothing. Nah, you know a lot. But I think that's a good place to stop. Get involved. Education is important.
It is the solution to almost, I'm biased obviously, but strong education can be the solution to basically any of the world's current problems.
Education and contact with the world's problems, like being involved and not just associating with it through a screen or through a second media, like actually learning about what you're talking about. Yeah. And being in contact with it. Yeah, absolutely. Which I guess is a form of education. All right. Thanks everyone for listening. Obviously, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, all that good stuff, you can reach out through the Facebook page, Twitter, email. We got all of it. I don't know. If you want to support us, as we mentioned, you can get ad-free episodes. You can get extra episodes, and you can get early episodes over on our Patreon page for as little as $3 a month. There's also a $1 option, but you don't get the extra episode. So why would you do that? As always, like you can send you can use PayPal for pay what you feel the show is worth, all that good stuff, right? And, as always, just leave a review on iTunes, tell your friends about it. And we're happy to just get people listening. Our listenership has been constantly growing and we're happy that is the case. So keep supporting us just with your listens. And that's awesome. All right. Thanks for joining me, Mac. Cheers.